Welcome to Mayo Clinic's ECG segment, Making Waves, continuing medical education podcast. Join us for a lively discussion on the latest and greatest in the field of electrocardiography. We'll discuss some of the exciting and innovative work happening at Mayo Clinic and beyond with the most brilliant minds in the space and provide valuable insights that can be directly applied to your practice. Welcome to Mayo Clinic's ECG segment, Making Waves. Today, we're delving into the relationship between vaccinations and atrial fibrillation. A recent study from the Biotronik Certitude Registry has sparked a conversation about whether vaccinations could potentially influence the risk of atrial fibrillation and other atrial arrhythmias. Joining us to unravel this topic is Dr. Malini Madhavan, an expert here at Mayo Clinic, a cardiac electrophysiologist and vice chair of the Division of Heart Rhythm Services here at Mayo Clinic in Rochester. Dr. Madhavan has and continues to dedicate her career to invasive electrophysiology and pacing, focusing on patients with adult congenital heart disease. Dr. Madhavan, welcome to the podcast. This is our first time having you, and we've been so eager to hear your perspective on this important and popular topic.
Thank you much for having me here, Anthony.
Well, first off, I think the thing that sparked our conversation today was this work that, you kind of spearheaded with Dr. Abhishek Deshmukh and the whole team here. Can you tell us a little bit about the research on atrial fibrillation, arrhythmias, that burden after the COVID vaccination? What are things that you would say are key findings from your work on this topic?
So the question came up really from a number of patient visits and questions that patients had asked about, should I get this COVID vaccine and I have heart disease or I have atrial fibrillation, and is this going to make it worse? Because they started seeing anecdotally in media reports and such that maybe there is some harm related to the COVID vaccine. So we thought it was really important to look at this question in a broader scale. So for this particular study, we chose to look at patients who already have a pacemaker or some other form of defibrillator device implanted. So these patients typically have an atrial lead, which means that there is recording of their atrial fibrillation burden with very high fidelity. So the database that we chose for this is called the Certitude Registry, which is the registry of all home monitoring data that is obtained from patients with a particular manufacturer called Biotronik. So patients who have a Biotronik manufactured pacemaker or a defibrillator would basically be in this registry. So what we looked at was we identified every patient in that registry who has an atrial lead, so we can know what their AFib burden is, and also underwent the COVID vaccination. We also looked at amongst those who had the COVID vaccine, how many also received the flu vaccine the year before. So we could have a historical comparison with a form of vaccination that is really well accepted in the United States. The third group that we looked at was, what happens to those with a similar type of clinical profile. So these patients were propensity matched with the other cohort, but did not get the COVID vaccine. So similar race, gender, similar age, and other risk factors like hypertension and diabetes between the groups, but one group received the COVID vaccine, the other group did not receive the COVID vaccine. So diving a bit deeper into the COVID vaccine first, so we found that if you compare the number and burden of atrial fibrillation episodes in the 3 months that precede the COVID vaccine with the burden that was right after, the 3 months after the COVID vaccine, there was a slight but significant increase in the burden of atrial fibrillation. So the overall increase was about 0.4 to 0.5 percentage points in the entire cohort. Of course, there would be certain outliers here where some patients had much longer episodes of atrial fibrillation in those first 3 months, but overall increase was about 0.5%, and that was a significant increase. Now, the interesting thing is when you compare the COVID vaccine to the flu vaccine was also associated with a similar amount of increase in the AFib burden in the 3 months after the vaccine. slight differences in terms of the COVID vaccine having a very small, higher percentage of AFib compared to flu, but numerically those were very comparable. So zero point 0.4 versus 0.5 percentage points. So our conclusion was that perhaps there is a very small increase in burden of AFib with COVID, but that's very comparable to the flu vaccine, which is a fairly well accepted vaccine in the United States that has been in circulation for decades. Um, the last part that we thought was very interesting is we wanted to look at, does this increase really represent a true increase that is related to the vaccination? Or is it just a natural increase that you would expect in a patient population that's aging? Um, so we know that atrial fibrillation becomes more frequent with age, and even though it is only 3 months, that's still part of the aging process. So we looked at whether patients who didn't have the COVID vaccine in that same time frame would also have an increase in AFib burden. And indeed, they did have an increase in AFib burden, maybe not quite as much as those who had the COVID vaccine, but there certainly was a signal towards an increase even in those who didn't have the COVID vaccine. So the conclusion number 2 from this was that the increase seen in the COVID vaccine group was probably partly because of the vaccine, but also partly because of just the aging process. So the overall conclusion I would state is that the study shows that there is perhaps a small signal towards some patients experiencing atrial fibrillation more after COVID vaccine, but that's a very small signal compared to the overall benefit that we would accrue from mass vaccination for a disease such as COVID. So our conclusion was that the COVID vaccine is overall a safe one from the perspective of arrhythmias. But if we have a patient who's already predisposed to atrial fibrillation, that's a time frame where patients should be more alert. And if they have new onset AFib, particularly to consider things such as anticoagulation, talking to their physician about how to treat it in case they have an occurrence after the COVID vaccine. But the overall risk is going to be very small.
Very good. So what I heard is that, there is this significant, albeit small, 0.5, 0.4% between the two vaccines of, increasing that risk, that burden of atrial fibrillation, albeit probably within the normal aging process of what we would expect, knowing that burden tends to increase is, one of the most important risk factors for atrial fibrillation. When you see these results, I guess, one, how do they compare to, have others looked at this, arrhythmia process or any other atrial arrhythmias? How do your findings compare to what others might have done? And I guess the other interesting thing is, were those that got the COVID vaccine, did they also get the flu around the same time, or were those at different times?
Yeah. So a two-part question, really important one. So the simpler one is, did the COVID and the flu vaccine happen at the same time? Um, we actually wanted to avoid that. So we took the patients who had their COVID vaccine performed in the year 2021, which meant that this was the first wave of the COVID vaccination because the vaccine was approved for general use around that time. But the flu vaccination had happened in the previous season, the previous flu season in 2020. So it was in the same population of patients, but temporarily dissociated. So whatever impact we're seeing on the AFib burden was due to that vaccination, not because of other concurrently administered vaccines. The second question was, are there other studies that have looked at this? How does this compare? There are actually some very interesting studies that have looked at this from other perspectives. And it will be an interesting comparison to study them. So one is really the sentinel trials of these vaccines. All 3 vaccines that were approved for use in the United States at the time of its first release in 2021 had large-scale trials in patients that did monitor for arrhythmias and other side effects. So the main cardiovascular side effect in those trials was really a slight increase in the risk for pericarditis and myocarditis, particularly in adolescent males. The risks seem to be significantly lower in older adults. Um, but there was no signal towards atrial fibrillation or other arrhythmias reported in those large scale initial trials that led to the approval of the drug. But we have to keep in mind that those studies basically enroll patient or individuals from the general population, where the incidence and the risk for atrial fibrillation is going to be much lower compared to, say, a population like in our study, where these are all people with cardiac disease that led to a pacemaker or a defibrillator being implanted. So this is a much higher risk population in our study compared to, say, the initial Sentinel trials. The other studies that have looked at this have taken a slightly different take on this, where the data comes from the adverse events reporting system. So it's a voluntary reporting system, not a mandatory one that the FDA administers. So if a physician feels that there is an adverse event related to any kind of device or drug, that's a reporting system that they can use to report that adverse event. So there is obviously going to be some reporting bias to what I'm going to say here. But one of our co-authors, Dr. Deshmukh, actually looked at that adverse event reporting system and found that there out of about 5 million doses of the vaccine administered, there was a small number of patients who were reported to have atrial fibrillation, a total of about 2,600 patients. And out of them, about 315 of those reported events were new onset atrial fibrillation. In other words, patients who didn't have a previous diagnosis of AFib. So even by that measure, 523 million doses of COVID vaccine and a reported event rate of 2,600 would point towards a low event rate, keeping in mind that patients can certainly develop AFib for other reasons too. So the association doesn't mean causation, but there seems to be a small increase in the burden, but nothing significant that would be a major concern when it comes to a mass vaccination campaign.
Wonderful. And it does seem that, if a patient has a device, already sensing the atria and this burden, that they're already at probably a higher risk of having an arrhythmia compared to the rest. And so, as you mentioned, I think even though significant, perhaps within, expected, albeit probably a higher prevalent group that might have underlying atrial fibrillation or arrhythmia risk at baseline. Now, this becomes a very important thing, the vaccines, whether, the wintertime, we're getting our flu vaccine, the COVID vaccine. A lot of our listeners that may have underlying cardiovascular disease or not might be hesitant to get these vaccines. I guess, do you have, just based on your work, and you've done a lot in this space, what is your message to them?
The message from the standpoint of any concerns related to cardiovascular side effects from the vaccine would be that the risk is very small and the benefit is significantly more than the risk that we would incur by getting the vaccine. So each individual should certainly speak with their primary care physician to have a broader discussion in the context of their medical care as to whether COVID vaccine is appropriate for them. But from a cardiovascular perspective, I would say that it's a very safe vaccine, particularly from the perspective of atrial arrhythmias and ventricular arrhythmias. Patients should feel comfortable about getting this vaccine.
Wonderful. And yes, I should have prefaced that this is, focusing specifically on the arrhythmias, and certainly you want to speak with your primary care provider about any other withstanding risks. Well, that brings us to the close of another great episode. Today, we had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Madhavan about a topic that's been on the minds of many of us, the relationship between vaccinations, the flu, and COVID, specifically focus on COVID this time, in atrial arrhythmias and atrial fibrillation, that burden. While initial data seemed to suggest a positive connection that we see, you want to, take that through, as Dr. Madhavan said, noting that there's probably more nuance to that. There may be an age correlation. And so, Dr. Madhavan, thank you so much for lending your expertise to this important discussion. It's a popular one. We really appreciate you taking the time and giving us some clarity on this topic, and hope you'll join us again.
Thank you, Anthony. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. We invite you to share your thoughts and suggestions about the podcast at cveducation.mayo.edu. Be sure to subscribe to a Mayo Clinic Cardiovascular CME podcast on your favorite platform, and tune in every other week to explore today's most pressing electrocardiography topics with your colleagues at Mayo Clinic.
This has been a Mayo Clinic podcast.